Welcome to the part of your story that you'll be revising for years. No matter where you are in the process of writing a story, whether it be a movie, a book, or the beginning of a tabletop RPG campaign, you've got to figure out how to actually start it at some point or another, and getting it right is not only one of the trickiest, but also one of the most important things you'll ever do for that story. So today we're going to be talking about how to start a story. I've begun plenty myself, and seen the whole span of beginnings, from those that go down in history to those that you see in high school writers' workshops. And as with many things in writing, one learns just as much from a bad example of something as a good one, especially when you're the one who wrote said bad example. We'll divvy this up into different concepts related to the beginning of a story and focus on what to keep an eye out for. The first of those, however, is going to be Part 1, Set the Scene. There exists a temptation among writers to, with the first line, start off with dialogue or action, and I'll waste none of your time in saying that that is typically not a good idea. In fact, bear that general concept in mind for the rest of this video and basically anything else I make, that writing is literally infinite in its possibilities, so whenever I say that something is not a good idea, all that means is this probably won't work the majority of the time unless you do it for a specific reason. Just saying that to cover myself from the inevitable good exceptions to these sorts of statements, because there are exceptions to every rule. However, those rules do exist for a reason. Anyway, what you actually want to do is start with one of two things, which I'll broadly class as narration of scene or narration of concept. These can be extremely brief. This is why I say don't start your first line with dialogue or action. And that's because all you need is one line, just one line, setting the basics of the scene before you go off to the races. So narration of scene is essentially just explaining where we are. At the beginning of a story, the audience has nothing to work with, maybe except your cover or your promotional material that you may have produced, but you can't guarantee that they've seen it and can't count on them having done so. Thus, at the beginning, you need to keep things clear and succinct. I know the whole rest of my channel is about how to world build an entire library's worth of history for your story, but fundamentally, at the beginning, your audience doesn't care about any of that, and they won't until you get them invested and immersed. Getting them invested might look something like Raymond Chandler's The Big Sleep, where all it needs to say is, it was about 11 o'clock in the morning, mid-October, with the sun not shining and a look of hard wet rain in the clearness of the foothills. And just like that, we're there. Yeah, we don't know everything just yet, but we're in and the picture is being painted in our heads. Then the other end of the scale is going for narration of concept. Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov does this, starting with a description of Alexei Fyodorovich Karamazov, who he is, who his father is, and we're given immediately interest by then immediately jumping to the father's mysterious death. Here we're basically getting a slightly more detached introduction, and one that exchanges putting us in a moment to helping us understand some key concepts. Both work as long as you get that hook in early, in this case the hook being the father's death. And none of this is to say you can't have an action in the beginning, you just need something first. Crime and Punishment is a good example here, which begins with, at the beginning of July, during an extremely hot spell towards evening, a young man left the closet he rented, etc., etc., etc. To solidify my point, I'll describe it this way. Imagine at the beginning of your story, you, the author, are showing your reader to their seat, giving them a little setting description, maybe naming or at least mentioning our protagonist and saying something about them. Anything along these lines is like pulling the chair out for them and inviting them to sit. Starting with something like, "The man started running," is like shoving them into their chair. It's not exactly guaranteed to make them get angry and stand up, but you're gonna have to justify why exactly you just did what you did. Sometimes you might want that sudden start and shove them out of the chair, but you need to pick them back up and you need to make it quick. However, there's a trick here and it comes with Part 2, Make It Stick. Famous first lines are a thing for a reason. To keep it on theme, why not mention Tolstoy's Anna Karenina, which starts with the line, "All happy families are alike, each unhappy family is unhappy in its own way," which is so famous that Anna Karenina opening line is one of the top Google searches for the novel. So that means your first line alone, isn't it crazy we're several minutes in here and we're still talking about your first line? Your first line alone is pulling a lot of weight. Get used to that feeling. I've been messing with mine for about 3 years. Don't be like me, or do, it's not so bad. Anyway, first lines only need to strike the reader, but also be helpful to their understanding of the ideas demonstrated above. The Anna Karenina line is obviously helpful because it tells us exactly what kind of story we're in for. Narration of concept. Say we contrast it with something very different, Blood Meridian, which gives us, see the child. He is pale and thin. He wears a thin and ragged linen shirt. He stokes the scullery fire. Not only do you immediately experience Cormac McCarthy's telltale prose, but come on, you know this kid is not in for a good time, and so it is. There isn't some big secret for writing the perfect intro. There's no one-size-fits-all nor an obvious path to figuring it out. And one doesn't even need a perfect intro to do well. Blood Meridian is considered by many to be one of, if not the greatest American novel, and while I think its intro is the same quality as the rest of it, the intro isn't what it's remembered for. So, what should you be aiming for? Something that gives the audience a feeling. Really, that's all you're trying to do at the beginning. Make the audience feel something. Because if they don't, then when you send out your script or your manuscript, if the agent or editor doesn't feel anything in the 5 seconds they give to look at your work, then there goes your chance. Figuring out what this feeling should be is something you may not determine for a long time. I've actually found that the first thing to do when you finish the starting draft of your manuscript is to nearly rewrite the beginning, at least if you've got any semblance of pantser in you. That's to say you don't have everything exactly planned out when you start writing. Hell, even if you do have everything planned, you might find things have adjusted themselves enough that your intro will still need some redoing. That's kind of a trick, by the way. I don't care what kind of writer you are, when you finish your manuscript, start editing. Anyway, the point is that whatever your intro needs to be may only become clear to you after a ton of other work has already been done. So if you're thinking you might not be able to determine what the start should be like, but you do think you can get the rest of the story going, then do that. Don't sit on the first page of your work forever when you know that regardless of how long you spend on that first page, you'll have to change some or all of it later anyway. But we're talking a lot of theoretical here, and so I feel it's only fair if I put up my own starting line for whatever it may be worth. And that is, the Prince in Silver is dead. I'm not one of those people who fears having their oh-so-precious ideas stolen by those foul people who will somehow take my idea and write it for me. A thing that totally happens. Point being, mine starts with a premonition, of which that line is the beginning. Starting with someone or something being dead is generally solid for catching someone's attention. So that was the idea there. And the Prince in Silver is a character whose identity becomes fairly clear early on, adding, hopefully, an immediate sense of tension, since we're given this idea that the associated character may well in some way be doomed. What exactly will work for you in this department will depend, and you might not have it for a while, or you might have it and then change it, but it's something to always keep on your mind. You never know when an idea might hit you, when you'll get that lightning in a bottle and write the perfect opener. But we can finally move past the very opening lines with Part 3, Pace Your World Building. This is the one we all know is true, but don't like to hear. I mentioned it in brief earlier, but it always has and always will be true that world building, as wonderful as it is an enhancement to your story, not the primary reason for which people consume it. It can still be crucially important and become a huge part of someone's enjoyment of your story. Just ask anybody who reads Warhammer novels, and by that, I mean me. All the same, especially if your world is leaning heavily on a world that is far different from our own, whether it's because it takes place in the past, it's in some little known part of the earth, or it's about a world of entirely your own creation, the way in which you present your world in the first, say, quarter of your novel is going to be incredibly important. And that is because you need to maintain balance more than anything. This, I would say, becomes the greatest challenge of writing good fantasy in particular. At least the greatest challenge that is specific to it. If you're too gung-ho about your world building and start talking about geopolitics and world histories when all that's actually happened in your story is that your protagonist has started talking to a random passerby on the street, your audience, not yet invested enough to have a reason to care about this information, will stop consuming the media. And fundamentally, this is because, and this is good advice for anything you do writing-wise, one of the biggest things to keep in mind is that your audience is lazy and will take the path of least resistance. This is true for everything. Books, movies, even YouTube videos. That sort of thing is why I try to write these scripts carefully, or make the audio decent, or make sure the video is at least somewhat visually interesting. Because if it's not, off goes the audience. And this isn't meant to be a cynical take or a diss on anybody. It's just in this specific way that pretty much everybody's kind of lazy. Whatever we read, watch, or otherwise are investing our limited time in, we want it to be smooth and easy to consume. And that doesn't mean it has to be easy to fully grasp or understand if we're talking about things like theme, but fundamentally, we need to be convinced that learning about this fictional world is worth our time and be lulled into compliance, so to speak, by an interesting plot and good character work. All the same, you don't want to be too sparing either. If your world is a point of pride for you and something you spent time working on and thinking through, and most importantly, if understanding the world is going to be important to the plot, which it probably should be, you still need to introduce these concepts to your audience. If you're too afraid to show things off, and instead magic systems just appear or countries yet to be mentioned invade, then you'll have a result from the audience almost worse than the boredom of world building too much. Frustration. And so we reach the topic of balance once again, and why it's so tricky. It can be difficult because 1. Your world building matters to the plot, 2. Therefore it must be foreshadowed, 3. While not overshadowing that which is actually happening in the story. But I'll be a little more concrete now and explain how I've attempted to do this in my own writing. So I have a fairly expansive magic system. It isn't particularly complicated, but it is very wide. In our homebrewed Warhammer Fantasy roleplay-based tabletop RPG system my friends and I made, there are like 400 spells, but mechanically the system of my universe's magic is simple. It's primarily elemental, fire, water, that sort of thing, except there are 12 of them. I won't break my own rules and start rambling and explaining them, just to say that it's quite a few different things, and they are all relatively important relatively soon. So how do I go about showing off 12 different elemental magical lores? Well, I'll tell you one thing. It's not by listing them all off with,
"As you know, protagonist, there are 12 magical lores, and now I will tell you about them all in exhaustive detail."
Instead, the novel opens with one of the magical elements, that of premonition, being demonstrated with that thing about the prince in silver. I make it clear that this character is using magic, but don't explain too much beyond that. And instead, I focus on what the character is feeling after seeing what he did. He goes for a walk with the person he's close to, and on their way they see another type of magic being used to wash the walls of the fortress they're wandering the interior of. All the while, the actual focus is still on those two's conversation. Their concerns, their thoughts, and all that sort of thing. What they're speaking of is just as important. It directly relates to the rest of the story, but I'm trying to sneak in those world-building details as they go. And that, essentially, is what I would recommend. The things that make your world different should, especially in the beginning, be the sorts of things that are self-evident, that have to be shown because they happen, and because they exist, not explained in some way that is divorced from context. Before we finally move on from this topic, I'll give just one last example. If you took a medieval peasant and put them in the modern day, and then wanted them to understand how a car worked, if you were writing that scene, you wouldn't suddenly stop the story to explain how cars work. You'd show one driving down the street, maybe braking at a stop sign, then, as the protagonist spots the driver, watch it turn off onto another street. The peasant may have some questions, but he'll understand the fundamentals and keep on because he just saw it work. With that out of the way, we move on to part 4, Get the Plot Moving Fast. This is much like part 2 in that this stage is about making sure you've got your audience's attention. But while those first lines in part 2 were what prevent them from putting it down after the first 10 seconds, this step is about making sure they don't put it down in the first 10 minutes. Now, if you've been successful with the previous steps, this one should become easier, which is why I put this last, even though one could argue this is the most important step. But if you've got a solid intro, and you aren't dumping world building onto your audience, All that's left is character and plot. I'm a lover of character-based stories and often would prefer an interesting character and mundane plot to a mundane character and interesting plot, but even if the character is great and the plot standard, that plot needs to get moving fast. This is the final part of justifying your story's existence in the audience's mind. If the plot doesn't get going, they might like your character, but they won't feel compelled to actually continue because there aren't any stakes yet. This in particular has been a challenge for me in the past because I'm writing a big multi-part series. I have it all plotted out from a sort of bird's eye view, and a lot of things don't get moving right away. That doesn't change the fact I still needed to get something going quickly, even if that initial starter isn't the thing that the overall story is entirely about. Because as it has been, my readers have said, well, J-Bat, I like your characters, but it doesn't feel like anything's happening. And you don't want that to be you. So even if your 5-dimensional, uber-complex and fulfilling plot isn't something that you want starting on page 1, you still need a 3-dimensional, relatively sturdy and satisfying plot, or subplot at least, to give your audience a reason to keep going. I mean, sure, Harry Potter, which I'll just use as an example because everybody knows it, is all about the battle with Voldemort, but the focus of the early stages of the story is on Harry getting out of his terrible home situation. That conflict alone was enough to get people through until that larger story developed, and if you can do anything similar, you'll be just fine. But with that, I think we've basically covered writing the start of a story. There's no one right way to do it, but hopefully this has been helpful or at least provided some ideas. Anyway, if you have any thoughts of your own about beginning a story or something you'd like to share about your beginning of a story, I read every comment and would love to see it. In addition, every like and subscribe goes a long way since we're still small here at JBat. We also have a Discord if you want to hang out with my editor and I, and a Patreon if you're crazy enough to want it, where we post all of our videos 1 week early.
Quick editor's note, we want to say thank you to our patron, Shadowrunner, a knight of the inner circle. And also, hi, this is the first time you're hearing my voice. I'm Yamez. Thank you.
Anyway, I hope you enjoyed, and remember, the only way you can enjoy having a finished story is by starting one.